Hello, my name's Ian Stewart, and I'm really glad that you've chosen to join me for this four-part series on Introduction to Problems of Evolution. And this first lecture, we're going to be looking at origin of life. It's perhaps helpful at the beginning just to consider exactly what evolution is. Now, generally, when you go to a lecture and your professor comes to the front, he'll generally give quite a general definition of evolution, of what evolution is. And the reason why he's doing that is he's trying to create this impression of evolution just being a fact, so you can't really disagree with it. So you'll generally find evolution as something like, all it is change over time, which occurs over the generations. Okay, so that's a reasonable enough definition. It does enable us to draw certain distinctions. Okay, so evolution is therefore not development. Okay, so it's not the same as the development of an embryo in the womb, as an example. It's not occurring over the generations, and all the information about a human is present upon fertilization. Secondly, it's not the same as natural selection. Okay, so natural selection is one of the primary mechanisms of evolution, but it is possible to have evolution without there being natural selection. For example, gene flow, genetic drift. So natural selection is just one of the mechanisms. It is not the same as. And thirdly, it's perhaps helpful to draw a distinction between micro and macroevolution. Microevolution is just small-scale change, different domestic dog breeds. Macroevolution is basically fundamental change, so a single-celled organism becoming a multi-celled organism. What you'll generally find is that Darwinists will refer to examples of microevolution, and they'll try and project that back to establish macroevolution. That's not always the case, but it is often the case. So having got our definitions straight, we'll just look at some classic examples of evolution in action. First is bacterial resistance. Now you see this single bacterium there in orange has become resistant to antibiotics. It's managed to pass on that resistance through the generations. Now that is a legitimate example of evolution. The only thing that I'd flag up, and your professor won't generally flag up, is that typically there's many ways in which bacterium can become resistant. But normally it's because, say if you've got a population of bacteria, they'll have a useful protein which perhaps builds the cell wall or transcribes genetic information. When an antibody attacks that useful protein, the cell won't be able to survive without it, so it'll die. However, one of the bacteria may end up getting a mutated form of that protein, which puts it as a disadvantage relative to the other bacteria. However, the fact that it has that mutated protein does give it one advantage, and that means it is able to survive the attack of the antibody. But as it passes on that mutated protein, that sort of mutated protein is, in a sense, worse than what the population of bacteria initially began with. So it's not necessarily a good thing. It's certainly not an increasing complexity. Evolution of the horse, 5-toe to 1-toe. Again, legitimate example. The only thing I would say is that you do get horses with small numbers of toes occurring earlier in that sequence. So it's possible that rather than a 5-toed horse becoming a 1-toed horse, perhaps it was a 3-toed horse becoming a 1-toed horse, which is a bit more reasonable. Black and peppered moss. You see the black in the Industrial Revolution, the trees were, say, black, polluted. Black moss were able to survive. Predators couldn't see them as they were resting on the trees. Then the Clean Air Act was passed. Lichens grew back on the trees. The predators could see the black moss, and the peppered moss had a selective advantage, and so the number of peppered moss increased after the Clean Air Act, as an example. The only thing I'd say about that is that moss in the wild do not rest on trees. Therefore, the colour of the background of the tree would be somewhat redundant, so I do flag that up as an issue. I'm not sure what processes the Darwinists went through when they're doing their counting, but I'd be a little bit sceptical of that, in all honesty. Now, if you're in Britain as I am today, or if you're in most of the Western world, if you say, oh, you think God created biological life, generally you'll well, people would be quite polite to your face, but ultimately they think it's a bit ridiculous. If I were to ask them why they think it's ridiculous, or what they think, they'll say, well, I believe in evolution. I'll say, why do you believe in evolution? They'll start citing these examples, okay, these neutral examples. Now, all of these, all of these assumes pre-existence of biological life, okay? It doesn't seek to explain origin of life, it just assumes origin of the biological life was already there. Okay, so you need bacteria already in existence in order to have a selection. You need horses already in existence, you need moths already in existence. So a majority of the arguments which are used sort of in favour of evolution, at least on a popular level, it's not a question of do they explain God or do they not, or do they explain origin of life or do they not. They just actually don't address the question at all, so there's no chance of them being sort of legitimate. Now, that branch of evolution which does seek to address the question is called chemical molecular evolution, and that is ultimately the belief that if you have matter and energy plus time, you will end up with biological life, or at least it is reasonable to believe that. Now, in the time of Darwin, and certainly following him, Haeckel, believed that life was very simple, that it was essentially undifferentiated protoplasm like a globule, and therefore the belief that the non-biological world could ultimately produce biological life was not particularly far-fetched. Okay, we now know it's not plausible because of the complexity of a single-celled biological organism, but at the time it was believed to be quite simple. And Miller and Urey experiment in 1953, they managed to obtain amino acids just through producing the conditions which are present on the early Earth, optimizing them, supplying energy. You're able to obtain just under 2% products, amino acids. Also, you may have heard of the RNA world, and the RNA world is basically this belief that because RNA has certain catalytic properties, because they can also be used to code for synthesis of proteins, that they were the, as it were, first molecule, that it was an RNA world, okay, rather than a protein first model. Now, essentially there's three basic categories of reasons why it is not plausible to believe that matter plus energy plus time will ultimately produce a biological organism. Okay, the first is obtaining the right molecules. Now, although you can obtain the amino acids of which proteins are made, because they're chemically very simple, you can't obtain the proteins. The proteins are extremely important. Okay, they build biological structures. Certain structures in biological organisms are made of them. They also catalyze certain reactions. So you're not going to have biological life if you don't have proteins. Okay. Now, with regards to proteins, if you do have amino acids, okay, they require the right type of bond. So the first problem is the polymer bond. Polymer bond is not automatic. Okay, it isn't automatic that they bind correctly. Second, chirality. Okay, you get L and D type amino acids. You need pretty much 100% L type in the vast majority of proteins. As soon as you get to D type, okay, it won't be able to fold correctly. Let's get cross reactions. About 85% of the Miller-Urey experiment was tar-like substance, okay, which is toxic for living systems. If you get under 2% amino acids, 85% tar, I mean, you've got no chance. Fourthly, sequence specificity. Okay, if you look at the 9 digits here, the number of possible combinations for any particular pin code are absolutely vast. Okay, now consider that you have 20 different amino acids, 20 different arrangements which are possible in terms of 20 different amino acids. They have to be arranged in exactly the right sequence to give rise to a viable protein. But the number of active amino acids is exceptionally rare. Okay, I mean, it's for a protein of 100 amino acids in length, it's 1 in 10 to the power of 30, which means it's not really plausible even granted the duration of the Earth. So given the fact you've got hundreds of thousands of different proteins, I mean, it's just no chance. Reversibility of reactions, okay, reversibility of condensation reactions, that's another reason, another problem. With RNA molecules we've got something similar. Reproduce conditions which are present on the Earth, you can't get the nucleotides. The ribose sugar arises through the four-modes reaction. Okay, the four-modes reaction does not proceed when nucleotides are present. Okay, so But we're looking at the subcomponents of the RNA molecule. You've got incompatibility of reactions, you've also got cross reactions. There's all sorts of different sugars which are produced in the formase reaction which bind to the nucleotide bases at the wrong points. Cross reactions, reversibility of reactions, similar as before. So I mean, there's knockout arguments in relation to subcomponents, and therefore there's essentially no chance for the molecule as a whole to arise, and certainly not an RNA world scenario. Now, in relation to the second major category, which is cellular machinery, we'll change gear a little point and just ask you to consider, if you're walking through the forest, if you had a look at the diagram here, if you saw that propeller motor at the back, how do you know, that the material of which it's made, the steel of which it's made, did not create that motor? I'd suggest you know that for a number of reasons. One of which is that the material of which it's made, the steel, cannot harness the available energy to do that work. Secondly, even if it could, it lacks the engineering capacity to do that work. And thirdly, because you consistently observe that such a structure does not arise without an intelligent agent. So we look in the biological world, so walking through the forest with appropriate equipment, we look at a bacterium, and we see that it's got a rotor, stator, a filament, propeller. We'll see it's got a clutch. Then really we can conclude that if it's made of, as it is, protein, the flagellum motor, then if you cannot obtain the materials to build the subcomponents, and the materials cannot harness the available energy to do the work, that even if you did have the right proteins, nothing automatic in them building that particular motor structure. So on the basis of the fact that there's no question of the subcomponents gradually arising, because they're all made of protein, and you can't get the materials, you can't get the protein to build these subcomponents. But even if you did, it wouldn't be able to build itself into the motor structure. And it's repeatedly observed that such a structure, particularly if we see parallels in modern creations of man, if you can't get one, the molecules, two, you're certainly not going to get the cellular structures. But we'll move on to the third category of problems, which is the terminal argument, that you can't get the molecules, you can't get the cellular machinery. But even more problematic is the fact that if you only have energy plus material, and time, subject to certain laws, the heart of biological organisms, you've got the genetic code, you've got a code, and the fact that a particular sequence, represents a particular set of instructions, that is software. That's a what is conveyed there is a non-physical message. What is transferred through that sequence, it is not energy or material. In fact, by definition, it can't be derived from material plus energy. If it was, it would break down in predictable patterns. The code would break down. In fact, in terms of the sequence of nucleotide bases which spell out the code, there actually are no bonds between those, the sequential ordering of bases. So there's literally no chance that a code, a conceptual thought, could have derived from energy and material. In fact, if you look at repeatedly observe, billions of bits of code all around the world, you trace that back causally, and it will be derived from someone's mind. It's never been observed that energy plus material could ultimately produce the code. You can't produce the molecules, you can't produce the cellular machinery, you certainly can't produce the code at the heart of that cellular machinery. So for those three major categories of reasons, we can make the following conclusion, that the chances of God existing are nothing less than 100%. It's not 99.9%, it's absolutely 100%. You can't even get the ball rolling. If you did get the ball rolling, there'd be all sorts of problems. And at the terminal end of it, you've got a code, which is really the knockout argument. Not as far as I'm concerned, it just is the case. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this first talk, and look forward to seeing you for the next 3 talks.